Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ASHE Discussant webinar. As folks are still making their way into the virtual space, we'll go ahead and get started in just a few. All right, so good afternoon, everyone, or it's afternoon where I am, but hello to wherever you are. I'm Cindy Brewster. She, her pronouns work well for me, and I'm the Director of Conference and Events for ASHE. I'm super excited to be with this bunch of folks and will defer to them shortly, but I'm here to just give a couple of ASHE housekeeping items in relation to today's webinar. So bear with me and then we'll get started. So a couple quick things. This event will be recorded and live transcribed through Zoom's transcription service. If there are other accommodations or ways that we can make this session more accessible to you that you have not already shared with us, please let me know. You can message me or email me. I also want to point out ASHE's Virtual Events Code of Conduct. And so while we don't anticipate that we will need to exercise it, it is important for us to share that it's available to you. As we want to provide a safe, productive, and welcoming environment for this session. I also want to remind you of the conference presenter guide. And so if you haven't had a chance to look at that, there is a section specifically for you as discussants. So if you are a virtual discussant during the pre-conferences or an in-person discussant, feel free to reference that, and I'll make sure to put that link in the chat as soon as I'm done. But the presenters today in their conversation will really talk about a lot of those things and kind of get beyond the logistical piece of it and really talk about how they embody the role of a discussant. There will be a Q&A at the end of the session. And so we encourage you, as you are listening to the panelists, to make note of questions as they come to you, or feel free to add them to the Q&A button below. As well as I'll give a brief demo for those who it will be helpful to on how to actually access the paper that the presenters have uploaded. And then lastly, if you have any technical issues related to Zoom, or if there are any conduct issues related to the Virtual Events Code of Conduct, feel free to message me or email me, and I will make sure to respond to those accordingly. So with that being said, I will turn it over to our hosts for today, Drs. Natasha Kroom and Jeni Hart.
Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are joining us from. Do some quick introductions before we jump right into this with our fabulous panel. My name is Dr. Natasha Kroom, and I am at Clemson University, where I acknowledge our campus and where I actually live, occupies the traditional and ancestral land of the Cherokee peoples.
Hi, I'm Jeni Hart. I work, live, and teach in the lands of the Tohono O'odham and Pasquayakis peoples. And yeah, happy to be here. In terms of panelists introducing themselves, I guess it's probably easiest in these kinds of Zoom meetings to call on folks. So we'll start with Dr. Bridget Turner-Kelly.
Hello, everyone. Bridget Turner-Kelly. I'm at the University of Maryland in Baltimore, and we occupy the lands of the Piscataway people that are doing our level best to acknowledge and understand the contributions that that community has made to the land. And I am using she and her pronouns and looking forward to the panel today.
Excellent, thank you. Dr. Jeni Hart.
Good afternoon, morning, day, whatever it is, wherever you are. I'm Jeni Hart. I'm at the University of Missouri. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I work and live in the traditional homelands of the Osage, Missouri, Oto, Quapaw, Chickasaw, Illini, and Iowa peoples.
Excellent, thank you. And Dr. David Pérez.
Bienvenidos, welcome. My name is David Pérez. He, him, his pronouns, and I serve as an associate professor of the higher education department at Syracuse University. Our department acknowledges the Onondaga Nation, the fire keepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral land Syracuse University now stands, and I noted the land acknowledgement in the chat as well.
Thank you so much. Before we move on to questions to Natasha and I, just want to acknowledge that when we think about land acknowledgements, and particularly when we think about land acknowledgements and moving forward towards this ASHE conference in Puerto Rico, we'd like to draw people's attention to the Boricuan syllabus, which is online and serves as a location for us to think about place and belongingness. And there are loads of wonderful resources that the LCEC committee has put together painstakingly and with love. So we'd encourage you to take a peek at that if you haven't been able to already. So, thank you.
Wonderful. Well, again, welcome to our panelists. First, I'd like to say thank you for saying yes and agreeing. I feel like everywhere I look, everyone's like, it's like January 2047 and it's the same day happening over and we're all super exhausted. So I just want to take a moment to appreciate you being here with us and sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us around this topic of being a discussant. And so we're going to kick off with our first question, which is, as you think about your approach, right, to this role as a discussant, how would you describe that? How do you approach your role as discussant, and what are some things that you might keep in mind as you approach this role?
Thank you, Natasha, for the question. And it's my pleasure to be here. It's one of my favorite organizations, so I'm happy to serve. So as I just kick us off here in terms of approach, I've been coming to ASHE over 20 years, and I hope it's not like this currently, but I remember being in rooms where people were shamed and publicly, I think academically, intellectually humiliated from a discussant going on about the lack of rigor or nonsense that they had read in someone's paper. And so I quickly signed up to be a discussant. And when I was able to do that in terms of my professional role, really wanted to just reframe what that looked like. And so I approach it as like a two-step process. One is an internal dialogue and process between myself and the authors, and reading the papers, giving them feedback as I would as an editor of a journal or a reviewer of a journal, trying to be really constructive, but sending that feedback to each individual author privately with a note for open dialogue and discussion. And then I see the other role as a public role, really looking at the papers and seeing what themes I noticed that cut across 2 or 3, and then using that as a jumping off point in my public remarks to the larger audience who hasn't read all the papers, to kind of help them see why these papers may have been put together in this session, because they may just be there to see 1 or 2 of them. And then hopefully it leads to perspectives and different lenses that people can have as we have a hopefully discuss it. I mean, I think about the word, right? It's to help people discuss and to understand those ideas. So I'll turn it over to my illustrious panelists to also comment.
I'm happy to comment. I think I approach my role as a discussant in a similar way, Bridget, to what you just described. I see my process as intentionally developmental. I recognize that people are approaching this work from a variety of different places, and I want to make sure that my contributions are to help them advance their work and ideally move toward publication. And so that certainly is something I have in mind when I prepare my remarks. I also like to pose questions publicly, what this research made me think about collectively and individually. I recall a session probably about as long ago as you mentioned, Bridget, probably about 20 years ago, where a discussant called out one of the authors and said, this clearly was a graduate student paper, and why didn't their advisor attend to this paper so it wasn't in the shape that I had to read it in? That is not how I want to approach it, nor do I think any discussant should approach work like that, because this is really about peer review and making our work move past and toward and further excellence. So I'll just leave it there and throw it to David.
Thank you. Yeah, echo much of what my colleagues have already shared. One thing that I'd add is I've been known to, in sharing my sort of feedback, my written feedback to folks, is I usually will time it on an email. You know, I'll send that send later feature on your email, and I'll send it like literally the minute we're done with the session, like as soon as it's off schedule. And normally what I try to do is even invite folks to say, hey, while we're at the conference, I'd love to grab coffee with you, your treat, of course. And I get really expensive coffee. But no, just take time to kind of connect with folks and process any feedback with them, or to invite a conversation even after the conference. And I can share like a more detailed story later on about like my first time serving as a discussant that relates to this point.
Yeah, I appreciate these remarks to the opening question. I think one of the things that I'm really thinking about is that this role takes a lot of care, particularly as people are sharing work and ideas that are in process. And I also appreciate all three of you talking about the role of a discussant being more than just in the moment saying some things for 12 to 15 minutes. I mean, certainly there's work on the front end, but I think also, David, your comments really signal work on the back end and on prolonging that engagement and conversation, which I think is one of the really special things about ASHE and being in scholarly conversation and community with people. So I appreciate those opening remarks. In terms of participant, oh, David, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, something that you just said struck a chord around the prolonged conversation. And I was thinking about one thing that I have found also helpful is when someone reads my work. I imagine for many people, we may have written the work, we may have like written the paper, but haven't thought of a home for it yet. And one thing I've really found helpful is when folks have suggested like potential publication venues, like to say, oh, you might want to think about these journals. And I've either found that someone has confirmed like maybe a journal that I was thinking about, or two has pointed me to, oh, you think that this work is actually maybe publishable in like one of our like more selective journals, right? And I didn't think that this work was, maybe I don't feel like that work is worthy of that. We don't often know what the authors are thinking about in regards to their work. I could tell you for me, I always feel like it's kind of, I have a pretty high expectations of myself. And then I, may not set the same like standard when I'm selecting the journal, but high expectations of like what I think the quality of my work should look like, and so, but I, one of the things that could be helpful is even like pointing, your remarks made me think about pointing people to potential sites to share our work. And the thing I've appreciated most has been identifying new journals and areas where my work might appeal to a different audience that cares about higher ed, but maybe writes in a particular area with regard to service or queer communities or, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. And having several editors on this panel of journals, I'm sure that folks would have lots of ideas about some of those things. So I appreciate that too. We have a number of people on this call, on this webinar, and who will probably watch this webinar after it's posted online, who are our first-time discussants. And I'm wondering, what are some tips and strategies that you may use to kind of encourage them as they prepare for the discussant role?
Yeah, so I'll jump in on that now. I'll actually share a funny story, and you're welcome to cross-reference this with some of my colleagues. They'll tell you this story. But I remember it was 2013. I will never forget. It was my first ASHE as a newly minted assistant professor. And I felt like I had to show up in a particular way for that first ASHE. It just felt different for me. I remember reading a series of papers, and I'll just name a couple of, the folks who were on. I still remember this vividly, but Gina Garcia was there, and this predates her book and the work that she's been doing on HSIs and servingness, but got to see that work early on in 2013. I was reading the works of some scholars who I look up to, Frank Harris, Luke Wood, Brian McGowan. We were coming up together. So I felt some pressure, giving my, presumably my senior colleagues feedback on their work, right? Not folks that we were coming up together. And then a paper that Marcela Cuellar had written with a student. And then the chair at the time was of this session was Amalia Dache Galino. So, academic all-stars, right? My first ASHE. And so I remember, wanting to leave a good impression. I read the papers ahead of time, wrote my, annotated my their papers with questions to prompt their thinking around things. My comments tend to almost sound like a conversation, like you could actually hear me on the pages. Like I write in that way, my feedback in that manner. Prepared my email, the send later email to folks, ready to go. And on the trip to ASHE, I got the idea to prepare slides. I was like, you know what? I want to present these ideas. I can talk a lot. Y'all all can nod your heads and throw shade. But I can talk a lot. And I was like, I'm going to prepare slides to guide my remarks because I really want the audience to engage the authors. I want to, as Jeni mentioned earlier, like I want to exit stage left and give time for people to discuss the papers. So I walk through my remarks. I give each author I highlight broader issues. I start with the bigger picture, right? And then I basically devote a slide to each author to talk through like the ways in which they push me to think about my own work, and then a question that I had for them, but inviting questions from the audience. And I left it there. Close my laptop, go sit down and take a seat next to Marcela Cuellar. I'm sitting down and Amalia gets on the mic and looks at me oddly. And I'm trying to figure out, did I say something wrong? Maybe I didn't do this right. And then I look to my right and I look at Marcela, and Marcela's looking at me, and I tell Marcela, did I share any feedback on your paper? And she's like, no. So I say, excuse me, pause for 1 second. And I get back up on the microphone, pull out my slides, and present my remarks on Marcela's paper. And Amalia jokingly made a comment. She said, "Oh, I wondered if someone had forgotten to submit a paper." And so I conclude my remarks and I sit down and we have a discussion. The remainder of ASHE, I was like stopped by several colleagues, Victor Sines, who said, "Hey, what did you do in your ASHE discussant session?" And I thought, oh man, people heard about me forgetting to comment on Marcela's slides. And he says, "I heard you prepared a presentation. Can you share your slides with me?" That was the sort of conversation. But I say that to say, I share that story to say, one, to think about how we enter the process prepared, right? And to think about what are some broader things that we might share about the sessions. How can we invite, for me, I always look at the work as inviting maybe even a critique of my own work or pushing my own thinking. And so I really try to emphasize that point and sort of conveying that to the author to say, you got me really thinking about this issue in a very different way, and I really appreciate that. And then to prompt a question that might, one, help them to think through their ideas, but two, maybe elevate the, like in some ways to engage people in the audience. A question that might prompt some other questions to engage people in, in some thoughtful conversation around the topics. And so, I really, for me, I care about this process. I've certainly benefited from it. And I always look to think through like what kind of feedback would be helpful to me to like advance my own work, and how can I then reciprocate that by giving people constructive feedback in this process. I yield the mic to my other colleagues.
Thanks, David. I love hearing you talk. So no apologies for talking too long. I just, something you said just also to related to Aziz's question and thinking about how you approach it. You said, oh, well, maybe somebody said, oh, maybe somebody forgot to submit a paper. And so that's what I would say is just kind of a tip to a first time discussant is, I know no disrespect or anything to ASHE, but sometimes the platform has been a little wonky to find the papers that get submitted for the discussant to go to. So I always try to look up who my people are and then just email them to say like, did you submit your paper? I'm your discussant. I'm looking forward to reading them. And then I try to have them also just email me the papers just to be super sure that I get them and enough time to read them. And then the second thing I would say is one time someone did not submit a paper, and it was a pretty senior or experienced, well-known, respected colleague. And so I was kind of wrestling in my hotel room with my roommate, like, what do I do? I want to talk about each individual paper, but I didn't want to shame this person, as I previously mentioned. And so I decided to just talk from their presentation. So even though they hadn't submitted a paper, remember I said that there was like this private process between me sending people papers, much like David does with track changes that nobody really sees. And then this public part is kind of talking about all three of them and talking about cross themes. So though I wasn't able to incorporate that person's paper in the cross theme, I don't think it came out as noticeable. And then I was able to still talk about that person just based on what they presented. Again, as to not to shame them. So I would just say, try to reach out to people to get the papers, and then do your best to even do your comments, even though you may not get all of the papers in advance.
And I would say, remind yourself that you were selected to be a discussant for a reason. So while you might feel a little sense of imposter syndrome the first time you do this, you were selected for a reason. And so you do have something to contribute to the scholarly conversation, and that's why you were selected. And so I think that's an important thing that I probably should keep in mind more often, but it's certainly something that I think is good to hear. I also do not show my slides, but I do organize every single discussant session exactly, David, how you imagined, how you described it to the group, that I have a slide for each person. I have a slide for overall comments. I do start with this is what I see my role as a discussant to be, because I think it's important for the audience to know kind of how I approach this work, so that if they're expecting something different, they're not going to be disappointed. But then, Bridget, something that you said also made me think about the I've been a discussant a few times where somebody has done further work on the paper since they submitted it. And so there is new information that they're sharing as part of their talk. And, I haven't thought about that yet. And so I try to, take notes while I'm listening to people speak, so that I can say, oh, I really appreciated how you went a little further on this particular point. And, not to say that I got your, you've done more work and I didn't see it before the session, but rather to be like, okay, I want to be thoughtful about this because I do think this is contributing in an important way, and here's why. So those would be some of the kind of first timer tips, I'd say.
And I will say I've certainly been a recipient of Dr. Hart's, oh, that wasn't in the paper. And it happened just like she said. Because in the paper, she had questions about that part. So it certainly, I can really appreciate what you all are saying in terms of the preparedness on the front and the back end, and then the thoughtfulness within each session that you're putting forth as you do this work. I really like the idea of like surfacing your approach for the audience. And that is making a lot of sense to me. And I feel like I've seen this before, maybe have even done that too. And it seems really important as not everyone is doing this role in the same way, right? So like this idea of like as an audience member or even as an author of one of the papers coming in and being unsure of like what's about to happen. So then like there's probably some comfort for everyone around the discussant saying, here's sort of how I've organized my 12 minutes, my 15 minutes, how much ever. So I can really appreciate that. And, you know, Bridget, you really surfacing this idea around, you know, sometimes folks aren't getting their papers in for whatever reason, but they're presenting. And so the importance of still bringing those people into community and still approaching it with sort of that same, the same philosophy, right, of care, right, care and intentionality. And, you know, David would not be David without the excellence that he brings, right, to everything that he does in terms of preparing the slides and right, like doing that level of detail. And I want to be clear, the expectation is not that everyone prepares a slideshow and it's an option, right? So to be sure that is understood. And so while we have a number of first-time discussants that are with us and that will be probably watching this, as Z mentioned, we also have folks who are returning discussants. And so sort of folks who've been doing this for a little while. And so as you think about returning discussants, what might be some ways that one might reimagine this thing in addition to some of the things you've shared for first timers? Because I mean, to be honest, like even if you're a returning person, maybe some of these things aren't things that you've been incorporating either. So as you think about being a returning discussant, how might they reimagine or spice this thing up?
Something you said, I've been something that y'all just jump in, something that you said, Natasha, when we were kind of talking about this session and imagining it was really helpful to me to think about. And I've done it for a while and I haven't really thought about doing it. So I hope it's helpful to other people who've done the role for a while and haven't thought about. But really your role as a learner, as you're reading these papers, and really, I think that also speaks to a level of care in our community in terms of I'm looking at this to see what I can learn from it, because oftentimes it's not, you're out of your direct, research expertise or something you study. And so it's as an opportunity to say like, yeah, they may need a better introduction or they may need more literature, but like overall, can I step back and say like, what have I learned from that literature? What have I learned about the methodology they used? Or I think you used an example of, oh, I hadn't even heard of that theoretical or conceptual framework. And now that may be something that applies to my own work. So I think even if you've done this before, approaching it from an aspect of what you can learn, and then I think sharing that in a public way, as well as putting it on the private paper, would be really helpful.
Building off of what you shared, Bridget, made me think about earlier the story that I shared. The session was around campus climate. And so it was helpful then for me to, I could draw to that, I could, draw attention to that body of literature. But one of the things that your question got me thinking about was almost like putting those three papers in conversation with each other. And to say, there may be something in one paper that, maybe challenges or broadens one's thinking about an idea in another paper, right? And so one thing that again takes time, right? It's not something you can do, real time by writing notes in the midst of a session. But thinking through to say, this body of literature points to this, and one of the connections I see is X, but I wonder about, A, B, and C. In particular, your two papers make me think about this, and I see you challenging this or advancing discourse in this area by doing something else. And you know, again, time and care. But I also think, you know, worthwhile, because I know for sure it was nice to see papers published in journals that I had read. Like I felt, it felt like my publication. Like I was like, I should get credit for that. But it was nice to see that work, to feel like, oh, I had a hand in supporting someone's work in that way.
Natasha, I don't think this answers your question at all, but what I was thinking about as David was just talking, and even in advance of that, was I like this notion of putting the papers in conversation with one another. And I would love to know if any of the folks who have been in sessions where they've had a really strong discussant who's been able to do that effectively have actually then collaborated together and had really done something collectively as a result of putting these things in conversation. You know, that would be a really cool outcome. I don't know that I've necessarily seen that happen or have heard of that happening, but you know, if that's something that I as a discussant can contribute to the scholarly conversation, I think that would, you know, would be great. So if I can strive for that as a returning discussant, you know, maybe that's one of the things that I could think about as I approach returning as a discussant.
I love that particular offering, and I think these suggestions are really helpful. I will tell you, as someone who's going to be a discussant this year at ASHE, all of this is very helpful for me. And as someone who has had multiple of y'all as discussants, it's wonderful to see that this isn't just something that you say, but it's something that you practice. So I really am appreciating the conversation, and thinking too about the generative nature of building connections and partnerships with people that maybe you previously wouldn't have reached out to, or maybe might have felt intimidated to reach out to in some ways, right? So thinking about the discussant role as a place to come together and think alongside one another, I think is really generative and really rich. So speaking of intimidation, there was a question that was asked in the Q&A that I think I might fold into our last question for the panel, which is kind of like, what else might you want to offer that we haven't been able to cover? And with that, the question that we've gotten is, how do you or did you overcome the intimidation of providing feedback to senior scholars or those scholars that you look up to? So anything in general you might want to offer, and also if there's something you want to offer around providing feedback to particular people that you look up to, that might be great too.
One thing that I try to avoid, and while I may put a comment in a paper, especially if it's really closely aligned to the work that I do, like, you might be interested in this article that I wrote in 1912, but I don't see my role as a discussant as an opportunity to showboat or kind of advance my own work in that session. I feel like this is an opportunity to showcase the work of the scholars who I've had the privilege to read their work. And so I really try hard not to do that. Now, the intimidation question is a really good one. And I will tell you that I think where I became less intimidated, frankly, because when I was a graduate student, my advisor had me, you know, I was working closely with him, and he shared with me a first draft of a paper, which was terrible. And he knew it was terrible. But this was somebody who I really looked up to and continue to look up to this day. And, you know, it was like, okay, they start somewhere too. And, you know, all I've read is their perfect work that's in the journal, right? And even then it's not also necessarily always perfect, but to see like this first draft of something and to know that this came from somebody who I've, you know, read their book was really, really helpful for me as an early career scholar to begin to think about, okay, I do have something to contribute here, and I shouldn't be intimidated because we all have to approach this work from where we're at the time.
I love that, Jeni. I can remember a member of my dissertation committee who we were collaborating on something, and that same experience, I was like, what the, you know, I had the, what the heck is this? And it gave me lots of latitude then for what I could do. It opened up the possibility to like do some half-baked idea writing. One thing I would encourage folks to think about is, I don't know, this question makes me think of like viewing this role as an opportunity to develop your voice as a scholar, and which I think is really important. And I learned that, I felt like I was paying attention enough when I was on the job market to get a sense of that when people would talk to me as if I were someone's student, and learning that I'm no longer someone's student. I have my own ideas. I may be building on some of that work. And so one thing that I would encourage people to think about is to think, maybe not to think through this as I'm giving this senior scholar feedback, right? And I should be intimidated, but more around like, what do I want to say? What kind of voice am I trying to develop in the academy? That's a different question that requires a different response, and maybe gives you the freedom to think through. For me, it was, I'm going to create slides to monitor my, what I say, or to frame what I say in a particular time, in a time limit. But also to think through, like, I want to be the kind of scholar that creates space for other people to talk. And so for me, how do I frame this session in that way? And I had folks like Luke Wood and Frank Harris, and so I definitely don't want to dismiss that concern. I think that's a very real issue, but maybe for all of us to think about, how do we want to use our voices?
Yeah, thank you both for that, because I still remember, even when I saw the question, I still remember getting my heart palpitating and, having to be a discussant for people that, we think of these like academic rock stars, and, we know they're just people, but their work has been so transformational or informed or, moving, that it's hard to think about, how could I critique that? So I think with this whole through line of what we've been talking about, the things that's helped me is to think about being in a community of scholars, and I'm a part of that community, no matter what role or how I joined it, whether I'm a student or a first year or researcher in a think tank, not even a faculty member, that I have voice, as David was saying, and I have agency to use that voice, and it doesn't do me or them any good for me to shrink my voice. And I think something my dissertation advisor shared with me that really helped me is people's ideas are people's worth, and their dignity as a human beings, never up for question, never up for debate. That people's ideas are always up for question, always up for debate. And so that gives you that gave me the freedom to say, I have questions about these ideas, even these ideas that are coming from people that I really respect. That their ideas are not sacrosanct because of where they are and they're in the field, that they're still open for questions and dialogue. And then also, as you're thinking about, I'm not shaming this person, I'm not trying to tear apart their reputation. If I'm coming at it from a place of care and community, then I'm just asking questions and raising questions, and I could do that with anyone.
Yeah, I love that idea of asking questions, Bridget. And I'll say that having both Jeni and Natasha as discussants before, seeing the way that David has engaged with people in our previous life at Miami together, and then seeing the way that you've engaged several of my colleagues and peers through dissertation proposals. I love the idea of approaching people with curiosity and wonderment and asking questions rather than saying, you ought to, or you must not, right? Now, certainly there are some phrasings and some ways of thinking that can be really damaging. And certainly if that comes up, we need to be thoughtful about how we address that. And also, I do love that approach of not only what can I learn, but what can I ask and how can I be curious about this particular paper in a way that doesn't create or build off of hierarchies within education, but just is about asking questions together in space because as you said, ideas are always open for debate. So I really appreciate that framing.
And I think also, as I think about that question in particular, I always think everything is a draft until it's not. So like, right, like everything is a draft until it's not. And so, right, like that's like, this is the process to get feedback on the draft, regardless of who you are, right? I remember probably like maybe 3 or 4 years ago, even though she's not in our particular subfield of education, Gloria Latson Billings like posted something that said, you don't go out on tour without the album or something like that. And she was talking about people who are like going to all these conferences and presenting all these papers, but they're not like publishing that work. And so even in that what that says to me is like, oh, okay, well, it's okay. Like that more senior or more seasoned folks, right? Like they need the feedback too. And like that they're part of this process, not just the production, like not just producing, like they're also getting feedback, like they need help on their album too. I've been watching that Wu-Tang Clan saga, so like everything is also right now like a musical reference. So and also been going back to their first album, so if you've forgotten about that album, go ahead and go back to it. But then the other thing that I wanted to mention, because kind of David, your comments made me think about this, and it made me think about cultural deference. Right. And so thinking about like cultural deference is a thing, right? Like if I'm asked to give, if I'm a discussant for folks that I consider mentors, that I consider in what we might call a sister scholar network, but that are more seasoned than me, I'm going to give cultural deference. That doesn't mean I'm not going to do the role, ask the questions. I love this idea of like curiosity and wonderment, right? Do the thing that I normally do, which is also like, here's what I've learned across these papers. But there's always also some room for some cultural deference if that's relevant to you. And I think that's slightly different than sort of the intimidation question, right? But I did want to just acknowledge that that there are cultural practices that like depending on your culture like creates a little bit of tension, and like we can grapple with that, and that's okay. And I think that folks are okay with that too, right? Like so that doesn't mean don't do the job, but acknowledge that and sort of work with that too. All right, well, we want to give an opportunity for Cindy to talk through some of the logistical pieces. Before turning it over to Cindy, dear panelists, are there other maybe quick, brief things that you're like, oh, this thing, I need to say this, or I'd like to interject this really quickly before we get to the logistical pieces?
I'm just going to add that I appreciate what everybody's been saying, but the last thing I wanted to say was that it just doesn't do us any good to tear each other down or to have ASHE be a community where people don't want to present their work, who don't want to come forward and make themselves vulnerable and share. And so the more we can encourage this role to be one that's welcoming and inviting, it helps us all. We all want really good research. We all know there's a lot of problems that we need to be looking at in higher ed. And so if we can kind of see it as an uplift for all of our profession, that it's service to the profession and it's service to our community. And that's something that we really have a lot of graduate students, I think, and Cindy can speak to this in terms of who our members are. We have a lot of younger professionals, a lot of professionals who are just now coming into higher ed. And this may be their first conference, or and we're also representing the association, that we've been put in this role. So I just wanted to share that.
I'll bounce off of that really quickly to say that it is completely a myth that in order to be a discussant, you need to be a senior scholar, because we're all scholars in this community. And so if it's your first time, you have as much to contribute to the conversation as somebody who's been doing this for 30 years. And so I don't know that, hopefully that's somewhat inspiring, but I think it's really important to hear because I was told very early in my career that not until you get tenure can you be a discussant, you know, and I really wish I didn't get that message.
And I'll just add, if you do decide to connect with the person during ASHE, maybe over a cup of coffee, order the café con leche.
Thank you, David, for always thinking about food and interjecting it into conversations. Always a good way to wrap up. Thank y'all for this conversation. I was taking notes. I didn't realize how many notes I would take, but it's good and it'll come together as I talk about it. For context, I hosted a session share training, so very similar to this on Monday. Such a good dialogue, and I even invited some of the session chairs, first time or returning to the session, and I see some of them are here. So I feel like it was really helpful for them to just kind of understand the role off of a piece of paper, right? And just kind of hear from actual discussants, past and present. So kudos to you all for kind of just framing the experience in a way that even as they are session chairs and they may want to be future discussants, as something that just sounds really cool and rewarding to do. And so some things that I'll share is to Jenny's point about, has there ever been like collaboration? Yes, that came up in the session chair training where a session chair, their topics kind of aligned with the discussant and they went on to write a paper together. And so that was such a really cool opportunity. And so that has happened. I don't know as much about discussant to discussant, but for session chairs, right, we shared it as an opportunity to build a network with the discussants. And so hopefully that's something that can continue to happen this year. Bridget's comment about the wonky system, no offense taken over here about our system as we work through it, and thank y'all for working through it too. I'm going to go into that system in just a little bit, but Bridget, as you were talking about the ASHE system, I was nodding my head with my camera off like, yeah, that's somebody who spends copious amounts of time with it. So thanks for laboring through that. And as discussants, I just want you to be mindful of looking out for an email from your session chair. So a part of their task is to email you all and to email kind of a connecting point to the discussant as well as the presenter. So if you haven't heard from them yet, give them an opportunity to, as we talked about on Monday, right, like allowing them to have that agency in the session as session chairs and taking the lead on that. So we ask that they email you all early October. So just be on the lookout for that. And that may be a really good point to respond, introduce yourself, and just start to build that relationship with them. I also want to make a note about PBDS session chairs, as that even that section is something that's fairly new to ASHE. And so because of the nature of PBDS sessions, where there is kind of like performance and all of those different kind of like artistic pieces, what we have asked of PBDS presenters is that they provide myself and Jason with just what would be helpful for the discussant to give remarks on, as that can be difficult if the first time that you're saying it is in that presentation atmosphere. And so if you're a PBDS discussant, we will provide you with information from the PBDS presenters on here's what we would love feedback on, or just like kind of here's context of our presentation. So be on the lookout for that from me kind of mid-October. And then the last thing is I'll share my screen to go into, thank you, Bridget, for that, for breaking that down. I'll go into the system, so I'll share my screen and just kind of give an overview of how to access the paper. One second.
Cindy, can I share one thing that I know I've done? And you know, this can be one of those, you and Jason can be like, girl, don't, but now it's already recorded and it's gonna be out there. So I'm gonna be real, like I have, as a discussant, I tend to read those papers on the airplane.
On the plane.
Right. And so there is a due date that they are requesting that your papers be to you by. And I have in the recent past just taken to emailing all of the authors ahead of time to say, hey y'all, I'm not gonna read these papers till I'm on the airplane. So feel free to send them to me, or put them in the system. And also you can email them directly to me by this extension. And I think that as a discussant, that's your prerogative, as Bobby Brown would say. But if you know that, you're probably not going to read them the 3 weeks or how many ever weeks it is before, Cindy will clarify that.
Definitely not 3.
Oh yeah, I was like 3 sounds like a lot. I think it sometimes is nice to give that extension. And if you it's gonna happen anyway, to give it ahead of time so people don't have to ask.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. While we are asking all presenters to upload their papers by October 12th, and we tell discussants that you'll have your paper by the following day, I think at noon, we recognize that many discussants will not look at their paper until they're on their plane or in the airport, or kind of in maybe like a traveling mode. So I appreciate you just bringing the reality of that for so many of our discussants, as we just understand that is the nature of the work. So with that, I'm going to just give y'all a quick demo of what the process will look like. And so this is the ASHE conference portal. And so if you just haven't even been here yet, this is the space where if you're just looking for the schedule for the conference overall, if you want to start adding sessions to your schedule for the conference, feel free to do that. But when you sign in, and keep in mind that I'll sign in and you all will see kind of more of the administrative parts of the system. So I'm going to try to not focus on any of that. But you're logging in as you would as an ASHE member. And then it's going to take you to the home page. And so what you'll see when you log in is kind of this menu over here. And what you're going to do is go to chair discussant. Because I'm not a chair discussant, my uploads look very different. It's really just sessions that I've created or things like that. But what you'll see here will be a place for you to, if these are our papers, you'll have the ability to click on this and then download your papers as such. So fairly simple process of how to access those papers. And then this is helpful as well if you are just a presenter on another session. This is where you can log in and see anything that you have submitted as well. So this is where kind of the place where you'll get access to those papers or that paper. So I'll stop sharing my screen to take a look at the chat and see. I feel discussant playlist coming on. I'm always down for that. Yes. So any questions from anyone on the side of the logistical pieces? I'm looking at my notes just to make sure I did not forget anything. If not, any other questions for our panelists or Natasha and Z, if you all would like to wrap us up if there are no other questions.
I think there was one question in the registration, maybe that was about whether or not the people who were presenting papers virtually, something around that. Did we want to answer that question, maybe?
Oh, I see it. Was it in the Zoom Q&A? Did I miss it?
No, it was in the registration Q&A. Sorry, I should have had it pulled up.
Okay.
And I was trying to figure out basically if they meant, did those papers have a discussant? And I was like, just clarifying the virtual paper presentations versus the in-person.
Oh, okay. Let me pull that up.
And that may have just been a clarification on the kinds of paper presentations that exist for this ASHE.
Ah, okay, okay. Let me put a link to the conference presenter guide in the chat, as that may be helpful. The major difference this year, and very similar to last year in regards to that registration piece, is that this year we will have both the virtual discussants and the in-person discussants. However, if you are a virtual discussant, you can only serve in that capacity for the pre-conferences. But we have gotten questions about discussants that are no longer able to travel. They're just kind of negotiating travel institutionally and both personally. And so we do ask that all discussants are, one, registered for the conference or event that they are being the discussant for. So if you are discussing for pre-conference, you want to go ahead and register for whatever pre-conference you are you're serving for. And then if you are discussing for the in-person conference, you want to register for that as well. So yes, discussants for those in-person conferences, we do ask that. There is no virtual opportunity unless you are serving as the pre-con discussant. So I hope that answers that person's question.
Yeah, and I think also the other thing about the nervousness around needing to be in person, I feel like probably the answer to that is if at whatever point, if the decision is that you're no longer going to be at ASHE in person, to just let us know as soon as possible so that we can make other arrangements.
Yes, that would be very helpful. But again, for all those emails I get, especially if you are here and you've gotten one of those emails from me, I just approach it with the level of empathy of just understanding the negotiations that our members have been forced to make and continue to make around just the context of the pandemic, as well as any other societal challenge that they're experiencing. So as soon as you can let us know, that would be helpful, because we don't want your chair to reach out to you and then you're no longer the discussant. So we really just kind of want to make that more of a seamless process for everybody that's involved in that session. But I'll go ahead and put the presenter guide in the chat just as a reference point.
And with that, we've done something that faculty groups often can never do, which is end on time. So big congratulations to us, friends. I just want to say another big public thank you, especially to the three people who have really been offering some really rich comments. So thank you, Jeni, Bridget, and David. The three of you are people who I look up to scholarly, and so I'm really glad to be in community with you and learn with and from you, and looking forward to all of the great discussant remarks that will happen virtually and in person for this coming ASHE. Thanks everyone for coming, appreciate it.
Thank you, bye everybody.